The greatest medical minds of the century stood baffled as the invincible Alpha King lay dying. 25 elite healers had surrendered to his mysterious affliction. Yet in under 60 seconds, a lowly tavern waitress would step over their failures, silence the royal court, and claim the heart of a beast. The heavy iron-wrought doors of the royal bedchamber remained sealed, but they could not hold back the stench of death that clung to the kingdom of Oakhaven. Inside, the air was thick with the suffocating aroma of burning myrrh-crushed lavender and the metallic tang of blood. Gideon Sterling, the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, was dying. He was a man built like a fortress, a ruler whose mere growl could bring entire rogue packs to their knees. For a decade, Gideon had kept the fragile peace across the territories, his strength unquestioned, his bloodline pure. But now that very blood was betraying him. Black spider-web-like veins crawled up his muscular neck, pulsing with a toxic rhythm that defied every known law of lycanthrope biology. His extraordinary healing factor, the legendary resilience of the Sterling wolves, had not only failed, but it appeared to be feeding the affliction, turning his own cells into a corrosive acid that ate away at him from the inside out. Tristan Hayes, the king's beta and commander of the Royal Guard, paced the periphery of the vast chamber. His face was a mask of sheer exhaustion and barely suppressed panic. If Gideon fell, the neighboring territories would descend upon Oakhaven like starving vultures. The peace treaties would burn, and thousands would perish in the ensuing pack wars. "Well," Tristan demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that rattled the glass vials on the nearby tables. "Speak, doctor. You are the 25th physician to cross this threshold. Tell me you have an answer where the others offered only excuses." Dr. Percival Finch, a man of immense wealth and supposed unparalleled medical intellect from the prestigious Southern academies, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. His hands, usually so steady when cutting into flesh or prescribing rare elixirs, trembled as he dropped a pair of silver forceps onto a velvet tray. "Commander Hayes," Finch stammered, refusing to look at the massive werewolf thrashing weakly on the silk sheets. I have applied the leeches. I have administered the moon gem powder. I have even tried the bloodletting techniques detailed in the ancient scrolls of Valoria. Nothing stabilizes him. The corruption in his veins is rejecting the magic. It is as if his wolf has simply decided to die." "His wolf has not decided to die," Tristan roared, grabbing the lapels of the doctor's expensive silk coat and lifting him off the floor. "He is being poisoned by what we do not know, but you were brought here to fix it. Tristan, drop him." The command was barely a whisper, a ragged scrape of sound from the center of the bed. Yet it carried the undeniable crushing weight of the Alpha command. Tristan instantly complied, dropping the physician who scrambled backward toward the heavy oak doors. Gideon's golden eyes flickered open, though the sclera was heavily bloodshot, rimmed with unnatural darkness. He looked at his beta, offering a tight, agonizing smile. "Do not waste your anger on the inept old friend." As the high-born lords and esteemed healers wallowed in their despair, nobody paid a single ounce of attention to the young woman standing quietly in the corner of the room. Her name was Adelaide Mercer. She was not a lady of the court, nor an apprentice to the grand physicians. Adelaide was a waitress, hailing from the Copper Crown, a bustling, rough-and-tumble tavern in the lower rings of the city. She had been conscripted into the castle's service a week prior, when the royal staff became overwhelmed by the influx of visiting medical dignitaries. Adelaide stood by a mahogany side table, her simple linen dress standing in stark contrast to the velvet and gold worn by everyone else in the room. In her hands, she held a large silver tray burdened with goblets of spiced wine and damp cloths for the sweating doctors. For 6 days, she had been a ghost in the royal chambers. She had watched in silent disbelief as 25 of the realm's most decorated healers paraded through the doors, each more arrogant than the last, bringing bizarre contraptions, rare crystals, and foul-smelling poultices. She had watched them bleed the king. She had watched them burn him with heated glass. She had watched them fail. Adelaide was no scholar, but she possessed something the men of high society severely lacked, an observant mind, honed by years of surviving the brutal reality of the lower city, and the pragmatic, earthy wisdom of her late grandmother, Helena, a woman the city had cast out for practicing forbidden apothecary arts. Helena had taught Adelaide that nature did not care for titles or grand theories. Nature operated on simple, brutal logic. As Adelaide poured a fresh goblet of wine, her sharp green eyes tracked the movements around the king's bed. She noticed things. She noticed how the king's breathing grew shallower every time the servants threw another block of imported crimson myrrh onto the hearth to purify the air. She noticed the pristine, snow-white bandages wrapped tightly around the king's chest bandages, brought in specifically by the royal physicians from the Eastern Isles, treated with a special ash tree sap meant to prevent infection. She remembered a night at the Copper Crown 3 winters ago. A trapper had stumbled in his hunting dog, dying from a strange, rapid rot. The trapper had tried to treat a simple scratch with ash tree sap, while sitting beside a hearth burning cheap crimson myrrh. Helena had taken one look, kicked dirt over the fire, and scrubbed the sap from the dog's fur, muttering about how the smoke of the myrrh reacted with the ash sap to create a vaporous neurotoxin, deadly to anything with heightened olfactory senses and rapid blood flow. Adelaide looked at the heavily bandaged king. She looked at the billowing smoke from the hearth. They aren't failing to cure him, she realized with a sudden chilling clarity. They are actively killing him. He is entering the final stage. Dr. Finch suddenly shrieked, pressing himself against the far wall as Gideon's body arched off the mattress. A horrifying guttural roar ripped from the Alpha King's throat, a sound so laced with agony and feral power that it brought the heavily armored guards to their knees, their hands clamped over their ears. The black veins on Gideon's neck rapidly multiplied, spidering up his jawline and creeping toward his eyes. His claws extended, slicing effortlessly through the thick silk sheets and digging deep into the solid oak frame of the bed. The wood splintered under his immense grip. "Hold him down!" Tristan shouted, rushing forward alongside 3 elite guards, throwing their combined weight over the king's limbs. But a dying alpha was still an alpha. With a flick of his wrist, Gideon threw 2 heavily armored men across the room, their bodies crashing into the stone walls like discarded rag dolls. "His heart is giving out. The corruption is absolute," declared Dr. Bartholomew Higgins, another elite physician who had just rushed into the room, watching the monitors of magical essence rapidly dimming. "We must evacuate. If the beast takes over in his final moments, he will slaughter us all." The room dissolved into absolute chaos. Lords and healers scrambled for the heavy doors, shoving each other in a desperate bid to escape the wrath of a dying werewolf. Tristan alone remained struggling desperately to restrain his king tears of frustration and grief blurring his vision. Adelaide stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds. If she spoke up, they would laugh at her. If she tried to explain the chemical reaction between the Eastern bandages and the ceremonial incense to these panicked, arrogant men, the king would be dead before she finished her sentence. She didn't have a medical degree, and she didn't have authority. But she had a minute. Dropping the heavy silver tray, the deafening crash of metal and shattering goblets was entirely drowned out by Gideon's roaring. Adelaide bypassed the fleeing nobles, sprinting directly into the danger zone. "Girl, get back!" Tristan bellowed as he saw the waitress darting toward the thrashing king. "He'll tear you apart!" Adelaide ignored the beta. She slid to her knees beside the roaring hearth, grabbing the heavy iron bucket of water kept for the royal hounds. With a grunt of exertion, she hurled the water directly into the fire. A massive hiss of steam erupted, instantly killing the flames and cutting off the thick, suffocating smoke of the crimson myrrh. Coughing through the grey steam, she didn't stop. She vaulted over the shattered remains of a bedside table and threw herself directly onto the king's bed. "What in the hell are you doing?" Dr. Finch screamed from the doorway. "Guards, seize that madwoman!" Gideon's feral gold eyes snapped toward Adelaide. His teeth were bared, a low, murderous growl vibrating in his chest. His razor-sharp claws shot up, aiming directly for her throat. Tristan lunged to intercept, terrified. He was about to watch a civilian be decapitated. But Adelaide didn't flinch. Moving with a speed born of pure adrenaline, she ducked beneath the king's sweeping claws, grabbed the edge of the pristine white bandages wrapped around his chest, and pulled with all her might. The fabric tore away, revealing the raw, blistering skin beneath. The pungent, sweet smell of the ash tree sap filled the air. "Give me your flask," Adelaide screamed at Tristan, pointing a trembling finger at the leather pouch strapped to the beta's hip. "Now." Tristan, operating purely on military reflex at the sound of absolute authority, unclipped the flask of strong distilled grain alcohol he carried for the cold northern patrols, and tossed it to her. Adelaide popped the cork with her teeth and upended the fiery liquid directly onto the king's raw chest, fiercely scrubbing away the remnants of the sticky sap with her bare hands. "Treason!" Dr. Higgins wailed from the safety of the hall. "She is torturing him in his final moments." "Shut up!" Adelaide snapped, throwing the empty flask aside. She pressed her hands firmly against Gideon's bare chest, holding her breath. For 10 agonizing seconds the room was suspended in a horrifying silence. The guards stood, frozen weapons, half-drawn. Tristan stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between the waitress and his king. Then Gideon gasped. It was a massive, shuddering intake of air, as if he had just broken the surface of a deep, dark ocean. The feral rigidity in his muscles instantly melted away. Before the stunned eyes of the royal court, the terrifying black veins that had plagued him for weeks abruptly stopped their ascent. Slowly, incredibly, they began to recede, retreating down his neck and fading into his skin as his suppressed lycanthrope healing factor, finally freed from the chemical suffocation, roared back to life. The color returned to Gideon's face. The labored, rattling wheeze in his chest smoothed into deep, rhythmic breaths. The 25 healers who had lingered in the doorway stood entirely paralyzed, their mouths hanging open in a collective display of shock. They had exhausted their vast fortunes, their ancient texts and their magical artifacts. Yet this unknown tavern girl in a stained apron had achieved the impossible with a bucket of water and a flask of cheap liquor. Gideon groaned softly, blinking away the lingering darkness. His golden eyes, now clear and fiercely intelligent, slowly focused on the young woman, straddling his waist, her hand still resting protectively over his heart. Adelaide suddenly realized her highly compromising, deeply inappropriate position. Her face flushed a brilliant shade of red, and she scrambled backward off the bed, smoothing down her wrinkled apron and staring at the floor. I apologize, Your Majesty. The incense. It was reacting with the sap on the bandages. It was creating a wolf's bane adjacent vapor. My grandmother taught me. She trailed off, realizing she was rambling to the most powerful man on the continent. Tristan stepped forward, falling to one knee. My king, how do you feel? Gideon Sterling slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position. He looked at his healed chest, then at the shattered incense burner, and finally at the terrified, brilliant young woman standing before him. The Alpha King, a man known for his silver tongue and commanding speeches that moved armies, opened his mouth to speak. But as he looked into Adelaide's defiant, intelligent green eyes for the first time in his reign, the king was utterly speechless. The heavy silence in the royal bedchamber was broken only by the crackling of the extinguished hearth, where the soaked ashes of the crimson myrrh still hissed beneath a thick blanket of grey steam. Gideon Sterling, the Alpha King of the northern reaches, sat on the edge of his ruined mattress. The unnatural black veins that had threatened to consume him were gone, replaced by the healthy tanned skin of a warrior who had spent his entire life on the battlefield. He flexed his broad shoulders, feeling the immense crushing weight of the magical suppression lift from his bones. His golden eyes, luminous and piercing, remained locked on the young waitress, who was currently attempting to make herself as small as humanly possible against the stone wall. Dr. Bartholomew Higgins was the first to shatter the silence. The elite physician, his face purple with a mix of terror and aristocratic outrage, pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Adelaide. "Guards, arrest this wretched girl at once. She assaulted the king. She threw unpurified well water onto a sacred royal fire. This is an act of blatant treason, a savage display of peasant ignorance that could have triggered a fatal shock to His Majesty's already failing nervous system. Silence." The word was spoken softly, yet it resonated with the concussive force of a thunderclap. The sheer alpha command woven into Gideon's voice forced Dr. Higgins to snap his mouth shut so quickly his teeth clicked. The king rose to his feet. He was wearing nothing but linen trousers, his massive, heavily scarred chest rising and falling with slow, steady power. He ignored the cowering lords and physicians walking slowly across the room until he stood directly in front of Adelaide. The height difference was staggering. She had to tilt her head back sharply to meet his gaze. "You!" Gideon rumbled his voice, a deep, gravelly baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down Adelaide's spine. "You are not a healer of the court. You wear the apron of a scullery maid, yet you possess the audacity to lay hands upon a dying alpha. Tell me your name." "Adelaide, your Majesty," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, though her bright green eyes refused to break eye contact. "Adelaide Mercer. I work at the Copper Crown Tavern. I was drafted to serve wine to the physicians." "A tavern waitress." Gideon repeated, a dangerous, unreadable expression settling over his sharp features. He turned slightly, casting a glaring look over his shoulder at the 25 elite medical minds cowering by the heavy oak doors. "A tavern waitress saved my life in less than a minute, while the greatest minds of my kingdom spent a fortnight actively burying me. Explain what you did, Adelaide Mercer." Adelaide took a deep breath, steadying her racing heart. "It was the bandages, Your Majesty. The pristine white wraps they placed over your chest wounds. They were treated with an eastern ash tree sap. It is meant to ward off infection, which it does well enough in the open air. But your physicians insisted on burning crimson myrrh to purify the room." She gestured toward the ruined hearth. "My grandmother, Helena, was an apothecary. She taught me that when the smoke of crimson myrrh binds with the vapor of heating ash tree sap, it creates a highly volatile, invisible neurotoxin. It acts almost identically to synthesized wolfsbane. It was suppressing your healing factor and slowly suffocating your wolf. I threw water on the fire to kill the smoke, and I used Commander Hayes's alcohol to scrub the sap from your skin. That is all." Tristan Hayes, who had been listening with wide eyes, suddenly stepped forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of his broadsword. "A chemical reaction. A localized, weaponized environment created right under our noses." The Beta's eyes darkened with murderous intent as he rounded on Dr. Percival Finch. "Who ordered those specific bandages? Finch, who requested the crimson myrrh?" Dr. Finch fell to his knees, openly weeping, his expensive silk coat pooling on the stone floor. "I swear it, Commander. I knew nothing of the reaction. We were merely following the prescribed treatment protocols dictated by Lord Harrison. He supplied the bandages from his personal trading ships. He insisted the myrrh was a traditional remedy of the old kings." A dangerous low growl vibrated in Gideon's chest. Lord Harrison was his uncle, a man who had long opposed Gideon's peace treaties with the Southern Territories. The puzzle pieces rapidly snapped into place. It was not a mysterious illness. It was a meticulously calculated, brilliantly disguised assassination attempt, orchestrated by his own flesh and blood, executed through the ignorant arrogance of the city's highest-paid doctors. Tristan Gideon commanded his eyes, never leaving the weeping physicians. "Seal the castle gates. Take Lord Harrison into custody. Throw these 25 fools into the dungeons until we can determine who was complicit and who was merely incompetent." "With pleasure, my king," Tristan snarled, signaling the royal guards. As the room was violently cleared of the screaming nobles and sobbing doctors, Gideon turned his attention back to Adelaide. The fierce, terrifying aura of the Alpha King softened marginally, replaced by an intense, burning curiosity. His wolf, which had been dormant and dying just moments prior, was now pacing restlessly in his mind, deeply fascinated by the scent of rain, cheap soap, and raw courage rolling off the woman before him. "You possess a sharp mind, Adelaide Mercer," Gideon said, stepping closer. "And a bravery that puts my elite guard to shame. You leaped onto the bed of a feral, dying werewolf to strip him of his bandages. Did you not fear I would tear your throat out?" "I feared that if I did nothing, the kingdom would burn," Adelaide answered honestly, wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek. "And I have dealt with drunken brawlers at the Copper Crown who were far more frightening than you, your majesty." A sharp, booming laugh erupted from Gideon, a sound so rich and unexpected that Tristan paused in the doorway, staring in absolute disbelief. The king had not laughed in months. "You are not returning to the Copper Crown," Gideon declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. "From this moment forward, you are the royal apothecary. You will be given chambers in the eastern wing, an unlimited budget for whatever supplies you require, and the absolute protection of my personal guard." Adelaide's jaw dropped. "Your Majesty, I am a waitress. I have no formal training. The nobility will skin me alive for taking such a title." Gideon leaned down, bringing his face mere inches from hers. The golden ring in his eyes flared with absolute authority and a hint of a protective promise. "Let them try. You belong to the court now, Adelaide. You saved the king. Now you must help me root out the snakes that remain in my castle." The transition from serving cheap ale in a rowdy tavern to walking the gilded halls of the Oakhaven Palace was violently jarring for Adelaide. Within 24 hours she had been stripped of her stained apron and thrust into fine emerald-green silk dresses that hugged her curves. She was given a sprawling suite, adorned with tapestries, a roaring fireplace, and a massive copper bathtub. Yet despite the luxury, the palace was a viper's nest, and she was the easiest target. The high-born lords and ladies of the court were infuriated by her sudden ascension. Lady Vivian, a ruthless aristocrat who had spent the last 3 years aggressively campaigning to become Gideon's queen, made it her personal mission to destroy Adelaide's reputation. Whispers flooded the corridors. They called her a witch, a peasant seductress, and a black magic practitioner who had orchestrated the king's illness merely to play the savior. Through it all, Gideon remained heavily guarded, deeply embroiled in the bloody work of interrogating Lord Harrison and dismantling his uncle's treasonous network. Adelaide rarely saw the king during her first week, spending her time in the palace's vast botanical gardens, cultivating herbs and avoiding the venomous glares of the nobility. The inevitable clash occurred on the night of the solstice banquet, a grand celebration hastily organized to publicly display the king's miraculous return to health. The great hall was an ocean of velvet gold and sparkling jewels. Hundreds of lords and ladies danced, drank, and schemed under the light of 1,000 floating candles. Adelaide was seated at the lower end of the high table, feeling entirely out of place in a deep crimson gown. Gideon sat at the center of the table, flanked by Tristan and the remaining loyal counselors. The king looked magnificent, dressed in formal military attire, his golden eyes scanning the crowd with predatory sharpness. Yet every time his gaze swept the room, it inevitably settled on Adelaide, burning with an unspoken intensity that made her skin prickle. Midway through the feast, the grand doors swung open, and the master of the kitchens presented the main course, a massive roasted boar, meant to be sliced and served directly to the king as a symbol of strength. Lady Vivian, offering a sickly sweet smile, personally took the golden serving platter from the servants and carried it to the high table. "To your health, my king," Vivian purred, placing the steaming platter of prime cuts before Gideon. "May your reign outlast the mountains." Gideon nodded politely, reaching for his silver carving knife. Down the table, Adelaide's nose twitched. The scent of the roasted meat was rich and savoury, heavy with garlic and rosemary. But beneath the heavy spices, masked almost perfectly by the searing heat of the flesh, was a faint, sharp scent. It smelled like crushed peach pits and damp copper. Adelaide's blood ran cold. Moon bloom extract. It was an incredibly rare, highly lethal paralytic used by deep forest assassins. It was odorless to standard werewolves, masking itself within the scent of cooked blood. But Adelaide had spent her childhood helping her grandmother identify the microscopic differences in toxic flora. Moonbloom didn't kill instantly. It paralyzed the lungs over the course of an hour, making it look like a natural heart failure. Gideon pierced a large piece of meat with his fork, lifting it toward his mouth. "Stop!" Adelaide's scream echoed over the loud music and chatter of the great hall. She didn't think. She launched herself out of her heavy wooden chair, sprinting down the length of the high table. Before Gideon could take a bite, Adelaide slammed her hands into the golden platter, flipping it entirely. The heavy silver dish crashed to the stone floor, sending the poisoned meat sliding across the dais. A collective gasp of horror ripped through the hall. The music abruptly ceased. Lady Vivian shrieked, clutching her pearls in feigned terror. Tristan's sword was drawn in a fraction of a second, but he froze when he saw it was Adelaide who had committed the offence. "Have you gone entirely mad?" Lady Vivian screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Adelaide. "Guards! The peasant has finally lost her mind. She attacks the king's table." Gideon sat frozen, his fork still suspended in mid-air, his golden eyes locked on Adelaide's heaving chest. "Adelaide," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Explain yourself." "Moon bloom extract." Adelaide gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the meat on the floor. "The meat is laced with moon bloom extract. It paralyzes the respiratory system. The garlic and rosemary were used to mask the scent of crushed peach pits, which is the byproduct of the extract's boiling process." Murmurs of disbelief and outrage swept through the nobles. "Lies!" Vivian spat her face, flushing with panic. She is a paranoid lunatic. She seeks only to make herself the center of attention. Again, there is no poison. Adelaide turned to face the aristocratic woman, her eyes flashing with defiance. "If there is no poison, Lady Vivienne, then I invite you to pick up a piece of that meat and eat it." The great hall descended into absolute, suffocating silence. Every eye turned to Lady Vivian. The beautiful aristocrat swallowed hard, her face draining of colour. She looked at the meat on the floor, then at the king, and finally she took a terrified step backward. I will not eat food off the floor like a common hound." That hesitation was all the confirmation Gideon needed. The Alpha King stood his chair, scraping violently against the stone floor. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his aura flooded the room, dropping weaker wolves to their knees. His eyes were completely gold now, the feral beast beneath his skin surging forward in defense of the woman who had just saved his life for the second time. "Tristan!" Gideon growled, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. "Take Lady Vivian to the dungeons. If she resists, take her head." As Vivian screamed and was dragged away by the royal guard, the rest of the court remained paralyzed in terror. Gideon stepped around the table, ignoring the chaos, ignoring the terrified lords, and walked directly toward Adelaide. Adelaide was trembling, the adrenaline rapidly leaving her system. She looked up at the towering king, expecting him to be furious at the public scene she had caused. Instead, what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. The fierce, calculating alpha was gone. In his place was a man completely undone. Gideon reached out his massive, calloused hands, gently cupping her face. The moment his skin touched hers, a visible shockwave of energy rippled through the room. It was an ancient, undeniable magic that every werewolf in the hall instantly recognized, the mate bond. Gideon's wolf had not just recognized her intellect and bravery, it had recognized her soul. 25 healers. Gideon whispered, his voice thick with emotion, loud enough for only her and the closest counselors to hear. 25 of the greatest minds in the realm watched me die. Yet you, a girl from the lower rings, have given me my life twice over. I only did what was right, Gideon. She breathed, realizing too late she had dropped his royal title. Gideon smiled, a breathtaking, genuine expression that transformed his rugged face. He didn't care about the title. He didn't care about her lineage. He wrapped his powerful arms around her waist and pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck and inhaling her scent deeply. A deep rumbling purr erupted from his chest, echoing through the silent hall, the ultimate biological sound of an alpha claiming his true mate. The court watched in stunned, absolute silence. The grand physicians, the plotting lords, and the arrogant ladies could do nothing but bow their heads as the invincible Alpha King of the Northern Reaches publicly pledged his life, his crown, and his heart to the tavern waitress, who had outsmarted them all. If you loved this dramatic tale of royal secrets, deadly poisons, and a fiercely unexpected romance, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to share this video with fellow fantasy lovers so we can continue bringing you epic stories of fated mates and courageous heroes. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment from Adelaide's journey. Thank you so much for watching.